Hi everyone. We're going to get started with our second panel now, International Broadband, How Others Connect. I'm thrilled that this panel will be moderated by Ambassador David Gross, who's taken a long trip from upstairs down to moderate this panel, and that he will be joined in the conversation by Dr. Richard Baird from the U.S. Department of State, Derek Cloven from Nokia Siemens Networks, the Honorable Susan Ness, the Principal of Susan Ness Strategies and a former FCC Commissioner, and Robert Tanner, Special Counsel in the FCC's International Bureau.
Thank you very much. We thought it was appropriate to have a panel on international in light of the fact that we are basically at the halfway point of the Winter Olympics. So we figured no sort of program could be complete without an international perspective. And I think using the Olympics as a bit of a jumping off place is probably more appropriate than I originally had thought. Since as we've watched all sorts of Olympic events, I am struck by how competitive and sometimes even aggressive Americans are about being number one, regardless of the event or the subject matter. The fact that my son and wife were upset about our showing in curling, for example, at the recent Olympics, since I don't think any of us really knew what curling was, illustrates the fact that when Americans don't place 1, 2, or 3, it's viewed as a national tragedy, even if in fact we don't really know what it's all about. And I was struck this morning by some of the comments and trying to put into context the national broadband plan that will be issued on March 17th and the discussions about deployment in the United States inevitably lead people to talk about the international comparisons and the disagreements about international comparisons. We have a terrific panel here that will help us illuminate both a little bit about where we've been, but also importantly where the world is going in the area of telecommunications and broadband. As you probably have picked up, what we will do is have, as we did in the first panel, brief opening remarks by each of the panelists. Then we will go into a bit of a Q&A session in which we will have an opportunity for you all to ask your penetrating and difficult and wildly entertaining questions as well. And so with that, let me start off with Dick Beard, who everyone knows in the international arena, who has been extraordinarily active for many years in representing the United States in various international forums, not just the ITU, but also at APEC, the OECD, and many others. Dick?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gross. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning and to share with you some thoughts on this subject. I have the advantage of having listened to Rob Atkinson's excellent panel this morning, and of course many friends were on that panel. And as I was listening, it occurred to me that perhaps one of the things I could emphasize that may not be always obvious is the extent to which the international community mirrors what is happening in the United States, or perhaps one could say perhaps more provocatively, the United States mirrors what may be happening internationally. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you take a look at the broadband experience, which is really very much tied, of course, into the distribution of the internet and advanced applications or services, as Kathy Brown prefers to call them, there are certain common points that should be emphasized. First of all, in all instances in the United States and the world, the social and economic dimensions of this deployment is extraordinary. It is clearly transformative. What broadband does is heighten that transformation. It brings us to a qualitatively, and because of quantitatively and therefore qualitatively different place than we have been in a dial-up or a previous world. And that has significant implications. Much work is being done on this. You can take the political aspects of more information coming quicker. We've seen this in countries around the world where the technology is very much tied to spread of democracy and to political transformation. Socially, it is quite obvious that it has also had an impact. in the area of gender use of technology, there is still a gender gap. 21% women tend to use technology, including broadband or other forms of internet, 21, on a global basis, 21% less than a man. And that this then is, by a regional basis, is increased from that point. That's an economic fact which has consequences, which is to say that if you can narrow that gap, there are economic benefits that we can come back on. So the point being is that there are significant social and economic implications of this technology in the United States and the world, and we share that. Secondly, broadband represents a catalytic role in economics. By that, it is a catalyst for innovation. The United States has been historically very fortunate in bringing together the convergence of government, universities, and private sector. And they are leaders in the deployment of broadband, and as a result, we tend to lead in the areas of innovation, and by some criteria, we are leaders in broadband usage in particular areas that involve commercial use. Rob Atkinson has interesting statistics on this. Or I would also say in the area of innovation. One of the notable points of this internationally is that there is an attempt to link centers of excellence. There is an understanding of this, that there is an advantage to link government, private sector, and universities. But internationally, it's a struggle. And we'll come to why that's a struggle. But the point being is that centers of excellence are understood to need to be linked, and that this has a benefit, a catalytic benefit economically in terms of innovation. The third point is that the United States and the world shares an understanding that public access points are required, are necessary. Listening to the previous panel, I made the comment to Ambassador Gross that, of course, smartphones are important. They are driving much of the applications and the use of the network. But in fact, a sizable part of the U.S. population, and therefore a significant part of the global population, must get its broadband access, if there is any, or its internet access, at public access points. This was brought home to me in a recent article in the Washington Post, which talked about Fairfax County, one of the wealthiest counties in the United States, and also having one of the finest educational systems of any location in the United States. For a significant part of the population of Fairfax County, the library is the place where internet access is gained. It's not the home. And in order to do the homework that is required, the students have to go to the library to use the computer, and increasingly the libraries are understanding this in terms of allocation of time for the student at the computer specifically for homework purposes. This is in Fairfax County. This is true globally. In Africa, the principal place where access to the internet takes place is the internet cafe, or the cyber cafe. What does this mean? This means that we must understand the linkage to public access points and broadband deployment. Larry Strickling, Assistant Secretary of NTIA, just announced a $13.4 million grant to the University of Utah. For what purpose? For the Utah Educational Network, where Utah links hospitals, universities, high schools, and other public access points precisely to make for the purpose that I am referring to. Fourth, there is a move to spectrum for increasingly as a carrier of internet, on broadband internet, and it has a number of reasons. Certainly, we've seen the quick leapfrogging of broadband or of internet access through spectrum-based services and applications in the United States. But globally, of course, it's required because the fixed network is so costly and is so limited in terms of its use for purposes of internet and broadband, and where there may be broadband access. Mobility is key, and this is particularly linked to, as was mentioned earlier, to the digital dividend transition, and this was watched very carefully at the 2007 World Radio Communication Conference at the ITU, where that was the principal issue. And it is going to be a driver for even further broadband deployment as a number of areas of the world transition from analog to digital and take advantage of the freed-up spectrum. But the point being is that the fixed network globally is far too expensive to accommodate rapid growth, and that you have to go to some form of mobile technology. I would suggest that in the United States there is a very similar, has been historically a very similar situation. In terms, lastly, let me note that one of the principal uses of broadband globally is for government services. And this was an early understood. Pastor Gross, who led the delegations to the 2003 and 2005 World Summit of Information Society, one of the consequences of that summit, where the world came together to give a perspective on information society, we took away from that an understanding that their principal interest was how can governments provide services to their citizens. And that is true in South Africa, that is true in China, that is true in Costa Rica, and it's true in the United States. The government tends to be an early adapter to this technology, and for purposes of providing services to its citizens, and the citizens increasingly demand it. And that's a global phenomenon, and that in many cases is driving broadband deployment. I'll stop there because I think I've probably exhausted my time, if not have gone over it. But there are parts of this vision or view that I'm presenting that I'd like to come back on and to give further indications where there may be similarities between the United States and global phenomena of broadband deployment that would help understand both developments in the U.S. and globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Derek, as a representative of one of the great international telecom equipment providers and network providers, how do you see the things that Dick were talking about going forward in terms of those differences and also the similarities?
Sure. Thank you, David. And first, I want to express my gratitude for being here, and certainly with esteemed colleagues on this panel. Feeling a little inferior, but that's okay. And just to pull back for a moment with Nokia Siemens Networks, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Nokia, and Siemens are parents, but just to be clear, what NSN is, we are going on our 3rd anniversary in a few months as a company, an independent company, two parents, essentially are a communications equipment and professional services supplying company, and one of the largest in the world. About $18 billion in revenue, and we operate in 130 countries. So significant presence, of course, in the U.S. and Canada from here in North America, but as David said, bringing a global perspective as well, headquartered in Finland. One thing I think that's interesting is to go up a higher level and look at ICT as a whole. And, this is not anything new. I think we've all come to a conclusion or assumption that broadband is important. But one thing we thought about was looking at, you have these deployment studies, you have adoption studies, we know where the U.S. ranks. What we did was we commissioned a study called the Connectivity Scorecard, which went a little bit beyond that to take a look at what we like to call useful connectivity. And what this does is measures how a nation or an economy combines infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, with IT skills that are complementary in education and services. And the headline for us a few years ago was when we ranked the U.S. #1, and we certainly heard a lot of comments that how could the U.S. be #1 when everyone said we're falling behind. But again, what the emphasis here is on using ICT as a way to grow productivity and consumer benefits, and in that category, the U.S. ranked really high. Where the U.S. didn't rank as high was on deployment of, say, consumer broadband, and increasingly now is slipping back on some other things like education and skills. such that our new report now has Sweden taking over the #1 spot. And interestingly enough, with Sweden, is they don't rank #1 in any of these subcategories, but they're right up there on most of them. So kind of a fascinating thing. On the global, I mean, I completely agree with Dick about mobile. Obviously, NSN provides both fixed and mobile infrastructure, but when you look at the world globally, it's going global. The ITU released a report this week that said the mobile subscriptions will hit 5 billion. It's pretty phenomenal when you think about that from a connectivity standpoint, or even from a purely a consumer electronics standpoint, to have that kind of an installed base. They also said that the estimate is now there's 640 million mobile broadband subscribers and 490 million fixed broadband. So I think we've already seen mobile broadband sort of take over from a global perspective, and that means a lot of different things. Really, to me, when you get to the idea of a national strategy across the world, what we see is it depends on the country, it depends on the region, it depends on where you're coming from. In the United States, we have a generally more solid fixed infrastructure and cable system in addition to the telephone system in a lot of parts of the world. That's not the case. But I think I'll stop with that for now and then come back to some other points.
Sure, thank you, Derek. In fact, just for people to know, because the numbers are just astounding, Derek talked a little bit about the 5 billion wireless connections by the end of the year. In a speech that the Secretary General of the ITU gave just the other day, he talked about trying to put that into some context. He said that the first billion global cellular connections were achieved in 2002, recognizing, of course, that wireless really began commercially in the early 80s. So it took about 18 years or so to get to the first billion globally. The second billion happened just 3 years later in 2005. The third billion happened in early 2007. And then the fourth billion happened in 2008. So you get a sense that of a population of less than 7 billion people, we will have about 5 billion wireless connections. Gives you some sense of how that is happening. And of course, the discussion now is how many of those connections will become internet and broadband connected. Commissioner Ness has long been active in the international area, having been very involved in various WRCs and other international meetings as well, and recently just became affiliated with sites looking at some of these issues as well. Susan, can you talk a little bit about some of the areas of which you're finding very interesting?
Also want to thank Catholic University and Wiley Rhine for the facilities and gathering today. David's comment on the Cyber Olympics, this competition that we have, my view basically is broadband is in fact growing more rapidly in other countries in terms of adoption, in terms of speed and lower prices than we enjoy here. And Chairman Janikowski recently made a speech at NARUC talking about 100 squared, as we talked about a little earlier in the other panel, 100 megabits per second, reaching 100 million households in 10 years. This will be quaint by the time we've arrived in 2020. Google made news by proposing to install a test bed of 100 gigabits per second in multiple locations, serving up to 500,000 people. But today, there are 1 gigabit per second systems in a number of countries scattered across the globe. For example, in Hong Kong, for $215 a month, you can get 100 gigabits per second service to 800,000 households. In South Korea, plans are right now to spend $25 billion to upgrade their system. They've got about 1/6 of the population of the United States, so that would be the functional equivalent of spending about $150 billion to do it here, to bring 1 gigabit per second to every home over the course of the next 5 years. Portugal, for 250 euros a month, you can get, through one of the cable operators, 1 gigabit per second to your home. In Japan, both NTT and KDDI offer 1 gigabit per second to residential buildings. Now, these are not across the board throughout Japan, needless to say. In my experience in traveling to Japan, it was a little frustrating to get any internet service, but that's another story. Singapore, 1 gigabit per second network will be ready by 2012. And in Finland, Derek's home base, it aims for 100 megabits per second by 2016. And it says that citizens have a legal right to broadband. It currently reaches 96% of its population with broadband, and it wants to get to 100% by 2010 with 1 megabit per second. So we see around the globe already plenty of opportunity to get access to broadband. And the 100 squared goal will be quaint also because the future of broadband will look very different in 2020 from what we see as broadband today. Just take us back 10 years, a decade. What were we doing? Well, AOL, the big dial-up mammoth, was buying Time Warner. If we can remember back to this, the definition, back 10 years ago, the definition of broadband was 256 kilobits per second. And it is today, 256 kilobits per second in the United States. Some things don't change. But in his book, Nicholas Carr's book, The Big Switch, he compares the deployment of the internet on the cloud as very similar to the deployment of electricity back at the turn of the century and the distribution over a grid. It enabled the creation of countless industries, diverse industries, and it really changed fundamentally how every aspect of society and how the economy was conducted. We will see, as was said previously, wireless being really the definition of what broadband is. And the notion that we are debating with the OECD statistics, should it be per household, should it be per capita, is going to be irrelevant, just as we used to in the 90s describe the growth of wireless mobile phones on a per household basis. Well, that went out the door, and of course it is a per capita measurement. The U.S. is also falling behind, in my view, because of our education system. We don't have enough students graduating in science, technology, engineering, and math. If you compare us to China, to India, we've fallen way behind. And if this trend continues, we are really going to become a society not of innovation, but rather one of imitation. So, but if we look beyond all of those sort of macho statistics, and we look at how the broadband or the internet is being deployed in these countries, how technology is being deployed, it is really profoundly changing so many things. Providing citizens with a tool to demand greater transparency from their governments, openness, and even democracy. It's not necessarily broadband, but the connectedness that is critical that this technology provides. In a landmark speech, Secretary Hillary Clinton made a speech on internet freedom that was heard around the world. Basically, she called it Earth's new central nervous system. The world knows in real time what's happening directly from citizens on the ground and using very basic technology connected to the web, be it texting, tweeting, sending video images. We remember Nida, the woman from Iran, who lost her life from a bullet that was heard around the world. Haiti, people finding out where help is needed by virtue of wireless technology. The first system that's going to be rebuilt is not going to be the wired system, it's the wireless system, clearly. Moldova, 10,000 young people materialized from out of nowhere to protest the communist election because they used texting, Twitter, Facebook, and they created their own searchable tag. In Mexico, 150,000 protesters protesting against drug violence originated because of the email of one citizen. So This is enormously important. We're going to be seeing more and more of this, and at the moment this is all to the good, but there is a backlash, and that backlash is, number one, the ability to track back to individuals and to punish them. We had 30 bloggers in Egypt who were arrested by virtue of their blogging. And you have, of course, an internet that is in large measure not becoming more unified as Secretary Clinton would like us to see as a single internet, but rather much more balkanized. With Italy, for example, Google, David Drummond is on trial there, or was on trial there, because of an event in which they put up on their website a short video of boys teasing a young boy with a disability. And Google was being held accountable for what was going up on the website. In China, you have to take down from your website, or just simply not put up on your website, certain information that China finds objectionable. There's now even protests that in some places they're going to require Cyrillic to be the high-level domain name. They don't want necessarily to do that because they don't want it to become more insular. They want it to become more globular. So there are a lot of issues involved with this, but the trend is extraordinarily exciting and game-changing.
Thank you very much. In fact, I believe, if I read the news reports this morning correctly, that in Italy, the 3 defendants from Google were convicted of that action. So a little news there. Rob, what's happening at the FCC?
Thanks to Catholic University for organizing this. I think they, maybe in retrospect, if they'd had a portion of all, they would have organized it for maybe a month later. There's lots of going on in the FCC. But not going to be able to talk a lot about that. What I can talk about, I wanted to share with folks today was some oversight of sort of the enormous effort we put into looking at basically what's going on in the rest of the world to improve the FCC's data and understanding of really just a lot of different approaches around the world. You've heard a lot of examples already from the panel, I think, give you a flavor of actually how big the world is and how many different approaches and different components different countries have been looking at in terms of organizing broadband plans and some of the trends and things that have been going on. A lot of what we've been doing has been pursuant to a statute called the Broadband Data Improvement Act, which did a lot of things, both for this, how we look at the Section 706 analysis, which the Commission now will do every year. But it also did some things in trying to get us to add some capability to our collection of data. And I think you saw the result of one of those just released, I believe, yesterday, which was a working paper on the consumer survey that John Horgan led the FCC, just a wealth of data that will be great for both the FCC and the entire community of folks that are interested in issues. So on the international side, we have been engaged in trying to collect a lot of information, some of which exists in terms of there's a lot of international organizations like the OECD, the ITU, the EU itself for Europe, and APEC already do some collection of information. We, because of the statute and also because I think it's very interesting, we've been trying to collect information at what is we call a community level, trying to get a little bit below the data that's aggregated at the level of countries and try to see if we can find more data that we can use for apples-to-apples comparisons at a community level. And we've made a lot of progress on that. I think we've collected a lot of information on broadband deployment and associated demographic data from a number of countries at the community level. We've also done a similar effort for pricing and broadband terms and conditions, and essentially, again, in a selection of a number of other countries around the world. And we hope to be able to sort of continue to do that year after year, whether it's the FCC continuing to do that, or whether we're working with some of the international organizations and our counterparts in countries around the world, whether other groups will be able to help do that as well. I think ultimately all this information is very interesting to all government and sort of companies and academics around the world trying to understand what's going on. Having said that, we've also been looking at, I think Susan just gave a lot of great examples of just different things that are popping up around the world. We've basically been looking at broadband plans and strategies in other countries. We've had a number of folks travel to engage in meetings with countries in Asia and Europe, so we were able to, I think, get a pretty good understanding of a number of countries around the world. Just to pick a few, so we looked at Korea, for example. There's a long history of plans there where they really started in the late 90s. And essentially, it really, as they would tell you, is a reaction to their looking to the United States at that point and just deciding that they needed to do things to change what was happening in their country. In Japan as well, they've had, depending on how you count it, 4 or 5 national broadband plans. And also we looked, of course, in Europe. There's a number of countries that have gone through a series of national broadband plans. Depending on how you count it, you have anywhere from 30 to 50, 60 plans and documents that different countries around the world are working on right now, where they're doing a number of things. So just to sort of throw out some things that other countries have focused on, there's a lot of, some of the numbers are thrown on the panel, there's a lot of focus on infrastructure in terms of looking at what's available in their countries. A lot of countries look both at a number that would be available to the entire population, or some very high percentage. But a lot of those countries are also looking at an even higher number where they're targeting some percentage of their country, and sometimes they're explicit if they're looking at urban areas. Again, as I think I said at the beginning, countries are kind of like snowflakes in a way. I mean, they're really all different, and you have to tread very carefully in thinking about any kind of comparisons. But it is certainly interesting to understand countries within their own context of their dynamic, their history, their demographic factors, and their infrastructure. And along with that, what's also very interesting, I think a lot of the plans the countries have focused on is there's a lot of focus on adoption. A lot of that is focused on things like what the government might be able to do in terms of promoting e-government. There is a lot of focus in a lot of countries on sort of e-government programs, whether it's countries putting their tax returns online, offering all or a high percentage of their government service interactions with their citizens and other population through a portal. There's a number of countries that have actually adopted what is sort of a consistent portal to the government of that country, trying to integrate all those sort of functions and services in one broadband-enabled access point. A lot of other countries have looked at a lot of other topics like education, providing assistance to the population and understanding how to use broadband. So there's a lot of different countries that have looked at that. Of course, again, as you drill down into the details, different countries are doing different things that are applicable to sort of the situation in their country. We've also held a couple of workshops. I think there were a lot of workshops probably in terms of folks saw the last 9-10 months in terms of a lot of topics about broadband. But we did hold 2 specifically about international. I thought were very interesting. And Rob, who moderated the panel before this, was actually on one of the panels. One, we focused, what I just sort of talked about is we tried to look at, on the panel we had a representative from Korea walk us through some of the things that Korea's done in its history. We also had a lot of academics and folks from the industry talk about their perspective on what's going on in other countries. Later, we had a panel on another issue, I think the FCC, sort of the International Bureau where I work, we've been looking at, which is the idea of sort of broadband globally, and some of the interesting things that as the world deploys broadband more globally, that global platform enables. And I think we've seen a lot of interesting applications and services arise out of that. So sort of a different angle on international broadband. Just sort of to hit on something very recent, because Haiti's, the tragedy in Haiti is very recent, and we've been very involved with that. We had a fellow on our panel, Joel, I'm going to apologize if I said Joel's last name. Joel's with Datadyne. He's a brilliant doctor, and had developed some technology that really works both narrowband as well as broadband, but it was to facilitate people in the field collecting medical information, funneling it back, and then taking information from central points back out to the field needs disaster areas. They've been involved with the help in Haiti and through both that, and he also is associated with Telecoms Sans Frontières. So there's a lot of interesting things like that you really can take advantage of the global infrastructure.
Terrific. Thanks, Rob. Let me, before opening it up for questions from the floor, let me ask the panel, and start off with Dick. Talk a little bit, it's important for all of us not only to look back and to learn the lessons from that which has already occurred, but it's extraordinarily important to look forward. Find out where the action is, what are the opportunities, what's happening out there over the next year or so that people should be aware of in terms of meetings, discussions, debates, and decisions that will be made that will affect everyone. Dick, if you could start off the discussion, then I'll ask the other panelists to chime in. Over the next year or so, where's the action going to be?
Speaking very specifically to the areas that I'm involved in, Department of State, with FCC and GIA and others, let me highlight three. First, the World Telecommunications Development Conference will take place in May, end of May, 1st of June in Hyderabad, India. It's sponsored by the International Telecommunication Union. Governments from around the world will come to develop an action plan in development, ICT development. Broadband will be a very important part of that discussion. In 2006 in Doha, Qatar, it was about NGN, Next Generation Networks, and the migration to Next Generation Networks. In 2010, it's about broadband. The United States is submitting a new technical question, if you will, for a 4-year study, which will talk about broadband, but its perspective is going to be about multiple technologies that are used to deploy broadband, whether it's IMT 2000, an ITU term for third generation or fourth generation and beyond, mobile. It will talk about NGN, and it will talk about other forms of access technology, not the least of which would be satellite. If we want to look at that issue, and we proposed that over the next 4 years it be studied as a means of looking at the deployment of broadband and its implication globally. The second meeting will be the ITU's plenipotentiary. This is the principal treaty conference of the ITU, where the direction of the ITU is debated. And I can assure you the debate is going to be intense. It's going to be intense because a number of countries will come to the meeting with the intention of orienting the ITU precisely towards a greater role in the information society. And broadband cannot be taken from that calculus. The United States has started its preparatory process, and it's going to be a lengthy preparatory process to October, where the meeting will take place in Guadalajara, Mexico. But I would highlight that spot because you will see the world coming to coming together to talk about the direction that the principal telecommunications organization globally should take in addressing a lot of the issues that we're talking about here. I would highlight also 2011. In 2011, a decision will be made of the OECD whether or not to reopen or otherwise revise the privacy guidelines of 1980, which have been instrumental in kind of guiding privacy policies in the OECD. Particularly have been important in the United States, which has a very kind of complex system of privacy protection. I highlight it because increasingly issues of privacy become points of discussion, as this technology, as no other technology preceding it, has challenged traditional understandings of privacy, and that will be something that will be the 2011 decision of whether or not to, in the OECD, to revise those guidelines will, of course, focus on the extent to which this technology we've been talking about and privacy should be understood in a different context because of that technology.
Before looking to the other members of the panel, Dick, if you wouldn't mind, if you could also just address briefly, this is a group of lawyers in a law school environment here. The International Telecommunications Regulations, which is a treaty. That's coming under a closer scrutiny. Perhaps you could just mention briefly where that stands and looking ahead for that as well.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Gross. I should also emphasize that it's a conference that will take place in 2012, so as far as I can tell, my employment future is secure by that conference. The International Telecommunications Regulations have been in existence. I think they were first, well, they are inheritors of the rules by which telegraph was transmitted in Europe, the origins of the ITU. They have been revised for over 165 years over various time frames. And the most recent revision, and now talking about telecommunications, was in 1988. A world that was, in some quarters, understood the internet but did not understand it to the extent to which we now appreciate it. In 2012, there will be a conference to revise the International Telecommunications Regulations. I should emphasize it is the only single document, treaty document in telecommunications in existence globally. That is to say that a document that all countries, 191, have agreed as a matter of consensus and have, in many cases, ratified. It will be, as I talked about the honeypot as a debate over direction, these regulations will really focus on what does the world think are the essential norms, if I may say that, essential norms for governing the technology that we've been talking about. There will be a number of countries that will come to that conference, as they've already indicated, because the preparatory process has already begun, wanting to include cybersecurity in the ITRs, International Telecommunications Regulations. That would, of course, be a significant debate. There are others who want to talk about new sharing revenue schemes in the ITRs, given the internet and how it has, I think now is significantly below $1 billion in terms of settlement of the traditional half-circuit network globally. It used to be over $6 billion for one settled from the United States abroad as a result of the traditional telecommunications network, the half-switch circuit network. It is now significantly below $1 billion to show you the alternative routing and technology is possible for centric voice. So this is going to be, it seems to me, a very important meeting, and it will be one that will focus all these issues. Preparations have already begun. They will be begun in intense form in 2011. So as Ambassador Gross says, I would encourage those of you with a legal bent and profession to keep watch on that space, because I think it's going to be exceedingly important.
Susan, you look like you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah. I think Dick outlined all of the upcoming meetings very well. Certainly there's going to be a lot happening globally that will not be happening in governmental fora. And we need to keep that in mind, because the technology and deployment is changing so rapidly that we will have to address a lot of these issues, country to country, people to people, network to network. And I think we're beginning to see a lot more of that as I was going through some of the democracy issues that have taken place. The cybersecurity issues are critically important. And in her speech, Secretary Clinton called upon basically all countries to, if one country's network is attacked, it is the potential equivalent of attacking all countries. And I'm certain that no one is going to be able to wait for a long-term solution to come from any of these conferences to address that.
Let me open up to the floor for questions, if we have any here. Please.
Either for you, David, or for any of the panelists. In some of the panelists mentioning the achievements in broadband and the expected achievements in broadband by some other countries, I don't think there was any mention of several prominent European countries, Germany, France, UK, as to how well or how poorly they've done
that? Rob?
I don't want to really, I don't want to speculate on sort of, comparing and contrasting them. I think that's not actually all that fruitful of an exercise. It's a lot more interesting to sort of take a look at the individual countries and try to understand why they did what they did and what kind of impact it's had in terms of that country. We have looked a lot at France and Germany and the United Kingdom. They're all doing interesting but different things. Just superficially, you have Ofcom pursuing the separation of BT and all the spin-off effects of that, and they have just recently put out their digital Britain plan. Germany has, been working with DT, and they've had a number of issues with how BT is going to be competing with folks in terms of unbundling and other resale rules they have under the European Union rules. And they also have, Germany, for example, hasn't had a very strong cable component for various reasons of ownership and other issues. Whereas in France, you had, at this point, you really have a very competitive environment, at least in terms of particularly Paris and urban areas, where the regulator, for example, is trying to figure out how to transition from DSL to multi-fiber network world. And those are very interesting sort of case studies to look at which we've been doing, and I think we'll continue to do as time goes on.
Let me just maybe mention also, in addition, on the focusing on Europe as the question just did, there are two things I think that I find particularly interesting. One, of course, is the issue and the continuing tension, if I may call it that, between the national regulators and the national governments versus the European Union generally and Brussels. That issue probably underscored both by some recent legislation that was passed pan-European by the European Parliament, but also by the new commission that has just been installed. Viviane Reding had been the commissioner responsible for these issues up until just this past month. That mantle has now, by and large, been handed over to Nelly Cruz, who had previously been the competition commissioner for the European Union. So Nelly Cruz, Commissioner Cruz, just gave her first speech this past week, her first public speech, and I think it's fair to say that her focus will both be a continuation of that of Viviane Reding's, but also with some different twists and bends. So I think that will be an interesting piece for many of the practitioners to focus on as well. And then similarly, the issue that was teed up last year, which is similar to the issue here in the United States, which is what is the nature of appropriate state support to serve unserved areas. An issue, of course, that's been much focused on here. Europe struggles with this. And I came up with a very interesting way of looking at this, particularly as they define unserved areas with regard to basically fiber and the issue of whether or not there was sufficient competition there too. And some of the repercussions of that, again, tension between what would be appropriate from a Brussels perspective, a pan-European perspective, versus those within each of the countries where some of the political dynamics are very active.
And just to follow up with, again, in this point, I think we keep hitting on is comparisons are difficult, but it's also what you're measuring. Again, I think anyone can look at an adoption statistic or deployment statistic, but just, I don't want to get one more plug-in for the connectivity scorecard. I mean, the way we looked at, when you look at the markets even in Europe, you see a difference between Scandinavia and, say, Southern Europe, and a lot of this has to do with, an enormous amount of factors that range from everything from, education systems. I mean, we come back to Finland, consistently ranked as, one of the best education systems in the world, and you can see how they take ICT and use it in, in successful ways. So, again, I don't want to go through it all, but if anyone is interested, it's a real easy URL. It's just connectivityscorecard.org. And then sort of circling back to the other point about interesting developments. I mean, one is to watch what happens with all these plans now, because Korea and others, they have been doing this for a while, but others really, this was a reaction in a lot of ways, much as here, the FCC's work to, the recession and stimulus proposals. So it'll be interesting to see how some of those start getting measured in terms of any success, and then how they evolve and what the new targets are. Also in Europe, it'll be really interesting. They were behind us on the digital TV transition, so you see a lot of the plans talk about this digital dividend spectrum. Which I think will have a big impact. And we're looking on the wireless side to LTE being deployed globally. I think it's really going to be an enormous project, but amazing potential. At the Mobile World Congress last week, our CEO put out a number that we expect, particularly from smartphones and netbooks and notebook PCs, the mobile data traffic globally will grow 100-fold by 2015. And I think that came out to a number of 23 exabytes a year, which is roughly the equivalent to, I guess, all 6.3 billion people on a planet downloading a digital book every day. So, it's an enormous amount of bandwidth. We got to get there. I think it's exciting.
A lot of reading to do. Chris?
Robert talked a little bit about the French market and the availability of 100, and I know the OECD talks a lot about that, about the French market. What we don't see a lot from the OECD is the depth of availability of these very, very high-speed offers. In terms of France, we find that even once you go outside the city center, it's not there. Susan talked a little bit about the gigabit offers. I'm reminded of Korea, which has availability of 100 to 60% of Korea Telecom's footprint. But yet we hear that roughly 78 to 80% of the broadband subscribers actually take the lowest speed offer available from cable. Hasn't the focus on sort of the headline grabbing speeds, and as something that Dick talked about earlier, which is what is or is not winning, sort of distracted us from understanding the strength of the market, what we're able to provide, where we're able to provide it, and also how to stimulate and develop demand among the populace. And I'll give you one example, which is the digital grid report that Robert talked about. It was roundly criticized after it was announced because the goal suggested was 2 megabits per second down, which, whether or not you think that was a good goal for Britain, was based upon sort of a hyper close look at its market and what its capabilities were. So I'd be interested in the panelists' thoughts about the issue of headline grabbing and speeds, 100 to 100, and whether or not that's a distraction.
Dick?
Well, if I may just jump in very quickly. We all have looked at these statistics in their various formulations. You can come out with a lot of different conclusions. There is, however, I think, from my observation, and looking at a number of studies and then just having just traveled in my career, you cannot take from these statistics the social and cultural setting of the statistics. When you bring that into the shorthand, when you bring that into the discussion, the United States tends to do extremely well. Why? Because our commercial practices, which is the corporate office practices, as basic as that, we know how to use technology. The way we make decisions, our collaborative efforts between universities, private sector, and government. The fact that we try to solve public access problems. It goes on. I can assure you that a number of countries where you may find by some analysis the United States would fall behind, if you factor in those other elements, social, economic, the United States has nothing to be ashamed of from that point of view. Also, just keep in mind scale. We always talk about the OECD, but the United States, in terms of subscribers, is nearly 1/3 of all broadband subscribers in the OECD, which is 29%. 62% of all subscribers in the OECD are only in 5 countries. Now, because you're talking about scale, those 5 countries happen to be the largest populations. And so, I mean, the point being is you cannot escape scale. And as a result, then you factor in the society, economic practices, and you never sell the United States short, is my bottom line. I want that quoted, by the way. Department of State.
Well, looking at the time, that's a perfect ending point, I think. I want to thank very much the panel. I want to thank you all for attending. I believe we now have lunch. In fact, it looks like announcements. I feel like I'm at camp here. Announcements here to be given. So I think a round of applause for our terrific panel.
Thank you, Ambassador Gross and panelists. We appreciate you sharing your insights and for being here today. At this time, we'd like to invite everyone to pick up lunch across the hall, and then you can bring it back here to eat, and we'll get our luncheon debate started in just a few minutes.
First of all, they're getting a signal, so that's AT&T. Your Verizon signal would be there, but it doesn't say anything about it.
Yeah,
You'll find out real quick.
I saw it on my Blackberry. I was there for the letter here, so I haven't had any interviews yet.
That's very interesting.
So I'll let you know who I sent the cover letter resume to.
That's fine. Just whatever your first choices are, then I'll copy that.
Okay, that's great. And I heard from 2L Laura Garrett County, so she told me that you need to email her. I heard that earlier today. From Brendan. Brendan was telling me that. Okay, everyone's telling me to contact you.
That was very insightful. My daughter is built to attack and joining forces and based wireless infrastructure company like Ericsson is also forcing people. Yeah, very big for it. We're still the same. One of the points you wrote up in the website is taking our intern. Brian. Brian. Yes. Brian Reed was trying to say anything. Yes. He's particularly always started that in the public. I always keep telling that he was that for so it's very good. Okay.
You have any right questions for him?
Sarah, how are you? You guys are coming. I'm going to send you an email and we'd like to get together. No, but that's okay. I'll make one. Here. Take it easy, Tom. Oops, that triple non-wire.
So how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I got Stacy. I know you got it too. Stacy's email about next Thursday. I kind of think we should be there. I mean, with the service.
She
thinks we're best off not being there, truly?
She said she thinks that our submission
Speaks for itself.
And she said that there are concerns
And the timing is probably
if they have questions and they to bring us in. They can't.
Okay, well, we don't want to do anything to rock the boat.
I think that just let them.
Say no more. All right, so I won't see you next Thursday. I'll see you in a few hours up there. This is very nice. I mean, this is just so nice. And I think it's... Yes. It's just such a hospitable environment. It doesn't have the tension, and moreover, it is 90 degrees. Well, bless his heart. Lonnie Ryan's done a lot for our school, aside from being one of the first mega firms to, break the mold and hire.
Work on up there. I think we should be fine. Hey, Justin. Good to see you. Good to see you. Okay, that makes sense. We'll just try and set up a call.
No, actually, it's ironic because I would need to give them something else and make something Google and Verizon about their desire to see DACA service on.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, the Burns has always been very supportive. And the NCPA got really excited about it. What's been most interesting is they're starting to fear the regulatory creep problem.
They start to see what they are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because the bound target, I mean, it's funny because people inside when they start to go, what is it when we're speaking of this? It's like,
What do you
well,
think?
the rest of our,
What do you think?
Right, exactly.
So, I'm going to talk to Ray before DACA's at 5 update.
I asked somebody else, but I just want to look at Hey, how are you? I'm good. Sorry I couldn't do it. Nice to meet you. Yeah, it should be fine. Yeah, they're, well, it's easy. You're pretty much just wind them up, insert coin. Exactly. All right, take care. Good to see you. Hey, thanks again for inviting us.
Is just a small token of appreciation.
Hey, how are you? Hey, nice to see you. How are things? Good. There's a lot of stuff I can be done. Thanks, of course. Sir, how are you? Good to see you. For spring. Other than that. That's my days at the end. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I think it's really yeah.
Having it downtown.
Never lived
Right. I sent an email to a friend in Montana, and that was literally what I said. I said, I can't imagine. Because it doesn't, I don't know, I get surgery, so you're right, you can see how people go, but it's, I think it's a great idea, actually, well, sleeping out of town. Right, yeah. One of two things happen, the weather's already broken, or at least I'm going to have a But you have a spring travel?
Okay.
Probably do that.
She's in Mount Pleasant.
Still there.
I've never been to Charleston.
She made the right decision. She was
That was the saber stuff too, right? Yeah, later stuff. Right, all of it.
Really? Yeah. I'll get my flights and stuff.
All right, well, I'll let you know.
Yeah.
not the
There's some weaknesses in that model.
so Charleston's really
That'll be good at least. Aaron, you'll have some food before we
oh
start.
yeah, definitely got some food.
Miles is left. So please. Hi, I'm Dave Rover.
I'm Kamala. I'm a reporter.
How you doing? have you heard anything about the red line being in some sort of peril? All right. Yeah, well, somebody said, and I'm sitting next to Dean Myers for the first half of the program. She's headed back to the school. And I can't, I'm surprised they didn't got you. I mean, I like had one of my weakest bars on the internet. Taking notes as we were. But I mean, I'll need him in actually. Yeah, all right, well, I'll check in. Very good. I'm going to have meetings with the next week.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, no news is no news. It's painless to be down here by a stand. If I talk to you, I try to.
I guess they're different ports depending on which laptop you have. Yeah, or like we have one down here that is if it's an IBM, like Spellman has, then we would have one right away. But oh, okay, wait. Let me. Oh, right over there. Oh no, that's a different kind. And this one you can use. This one's not the right size, right?
That's power, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's plugged right back here.
Oh, I have an extension port where, I mean...
I would know there. The video's plugged in, and I'm in, but I have no battery, so I unplug.
It dies right away.
Yeah, in 12 minutes.
Well, that would be a good idea.
Extension cord or a three-way outlet.
Right over there, a little far away. Or there might be some, let me see.
Or, I mean, what I could try.
Looks like we'd have a great back.
Yeah. But I don't think it's enough for 2 girls.
Probably. In your business, you can't afford to run out of that.
Can I help you?
I know we've been before. Don Johnson, I was at Catholic. Program was just getting enough for I went down to Florida. Now I work at FCC for the last
How long have you been there?
It's been about 10 years. I just do power supply. So I get kind of compartmentalized, I guess. But it's all, this is
The first time we tried it off campus, downtown, private lines, more gracious. 10 minutes. National environment, more recently, Swartz court is out at law school. For some reason, it could be 20 degrees out, it's still 85. For some reason, we got the air conditioning ventilation now. That's where I started. I started in 85, and 90, and it was a bit. The students are great, and I loved it.
You know, the old law school, she was the worst. The old university, which is this looks exactly like where I spend my evenings. We're in the city. It looks like parochial.
We can see the block cement.
So it wasn't just Catholic.
She's going to be seen, yeah, you just don't have seen.
Yeah. Oh, it's gorgeous. Yeah.
That is certainly gorgeous. Yes. Hey, God. See ya. The veterans gather and see you guys go. Oh, the new American. Yeah, the hearing today on wireless privacy. I got the Olympics. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Lunch in Debate, the Preserving the Open Internet and PRM. Let me introduce our moderator, Brian Tremont, the managing partner at Wilkinson Barker Nauer, and our two debaters for today, Ben Scott, the policy director at Free Press, and Adam Thierer, president of Progress and Freedom Foundation. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you, Rachel, very much, and congratulations to you and to Kevin on putting together a tremendous symposium. I think certainly setting a high water mark for future conferences. They've done a terrific job, so hats off to you two. It's really been fantastic. So that tradition continues with our luncheon speakers. We're going to have a hopefully lively and entertaining exchange between Adam and Ben. We talked earlier in the week and flipped a coin around who goes first. Adam will go first. He'll have 3 minutes to give opening remarks regarding his views on how we ensure the future of the open internet. And then Ben will respond, and then we'll have some questions from me, and then open it up to some questions from the audience. So with that, it's Gary.
Well, thank you, Brian. I want to thank Catholic University and Wiley Ryan for inviting me here today to talk about this issue, because it just doesn't get enough press in this town. You know, in fact, maybe just Ben and I can switch roles and we'll give each other speeches because they really mix it up. No, I can't do that. So I'm going to try in my 3 minutes to do a lightning round 5-part case against net neutrality regulation, summarizing it from a paper I've just been wrapping up. And here it goes. So really the 5 parts are legal, economic, engineering, practical, and then sort of philosophical. Legal case, quite obviously, is that the FCC utterly lacks the authority to regulate in this arena, and my colleague Barbara Espin just wrote the definitive paper on filing on that I encourage you all to read. And importantly, the FCC's actions to try to use things like Section 230 or 706 of the Telecommunications Act really cannot be the hook, since they were really quite deregulatory in character. Those of us who worked on those provisions remember that back in the mid-90s. And then finally, part of the legal case is the litigation and lawyering nightmare that it creates if we continue to plot down that path. The economic case, the second part of the case, is really that net neutrality will create substantial disincentives to invest and innovate. And in a time when we're trying to build out broadband in America, the last thing we should be doing is disincentivizing network construction and investment. And moreover, if this is all just a front for reemergence of some sort of a line sharing or a forced access regime, I'll just remind everyone that sharing is not the same as competing. Facilities-based competition, not infrastructure sharing, is the right path forward. The engineering case, the third part of the case against net neutrality, is that we shouldn't be freezing networks and protocols in stone. Flexibility is crucial for fast-moving technologies and networks. Never more so has that been the case than with something like the internet. Moreover, innovation at the edge of networks is always talked about in these debates. So innovation at the core is every bit as important, and we need to make sure we allow for that. The fourth part, the practical case against, really comes down to the fact that the FCC is not very good at regulating fast-moving industries and technologies. And also that there's no such thing as a quote-unquote simple rule when it comes to an amorphous concept like neutrality. Moreover, the potential for industry capture and regulatory creep grows exponentially here as the size of this regulatory regime grows for the internet ecosystem. And then finally, markets need not be perfect to be preferable to government regulation. Fifth and finally, the philosophical or principled case against net neutrality, if you will, begins with the simple question of whatever happened to hands off the net? Do we believe in markets or not? And are we willing to allow the experiment we started with the Telecommunications Act of 1996 continue? Because net neutrality, in my opinion, is really a declaration of surrender and a call for a return to the era of public utility-style regulation. Moreover, the slippery slope associated with neutrality regulation is quite real. What I fear is that the Federal Communications Commission will eventually become the Federal Cloud Commission and start regulating everything in sight. And then finally, there are some very serious and real First Amendment concerns here. But they're most definitely not the ones raised by those regulatory advocates who claim that net neutrality is the Internet's First Amendment. The First Amendment is the Internet's First Amendment, not net neutrality. Let's not forget that. Hopefully that was less than 3 minutes, but
yeah, well done, no time. So Scott, response.
Well, I will, I'll start at 30,000 feet and then I'm sure we'll get into all of the specifics of jurisdiction in particular and economics as we proceed through the course of our lunch. I want to start by just identifying this moment in the history of communications policy as a critical one, and one that merits the kind of attention that the issue of net neutrality was getting, because we're at a technological moment of transition. We've seen it just a few times in the last 100 years when a technology displaces the previous dominant form of mass communications. We saw it with the advent of radio, we saw it with the advent of broadcast television, we saw it with the advent of cable television. In each case, you saw both a paradigm-shifting technological moment and a paradigm-shifting policy moment, where the framework for the policies that would shape the markets, that would produce the outcomes that would matter for people's lives, were made. In each of those cases previously, the common element was the total lack of public participation. And therefore, we have today a public that is largely uneducated as to why and how communications markets are the way they are. With the internet, that changes because you have the same kind of paradigm-shifting policy moment, and you have rules and regulations that are governing the internet. And the public is participating because you also have instantaneous communications and education via the internet. That's why network neutrality has become such a lightning rod issue, because the threshold issue for this larger question of who is going to set the terms of the debate, who is going to set the rules of the road for the future of the next dominant form of mass communications. So I want to make a couple of sub-points before I run out of my opening time. One is that we're not regulating the internet. We're regulating the networks that connect people to the internet. That physical layer of the internet is very different from the content and applications layer. I think Adam and I would be in total agreement about the dangers of pushing regulations into the content and applications layer. Second, it is not an outlandish notion in either economic or policy theory to say you need regulation in a marketplace that's concentrated in order to promote competition atop that marketplace. So in this case, you need to be able to regulate the cable and telephone companies' infrastructure in order to promote competition at the applications and content layer. And this has a positive externality of promoting not just commerce, but also speech and the free flow of information. So I'll stop there. I think I've probably exhausted my time, and we'll get into specifics.
Okay, undoubtedly in a unlikely effort to find common ground, at least on some of these. Adam, let's start with some of Ben's assertions on paradigm-shifting moment, historical change, and the public is participating. Well, how does that, do you agree, and how does that inform your thinking here?
Yeah, we've had a paradigm-shifting moment. I mean, the internet has been a huge paradigm shift away from the traditional regulatory models of the past, whether we're talking about public utility-style regulation or public interest-style regulation or whatever else. I mean, but the problem is with net neutrality and the sorts of regulations that are being proposed, a lot of people want to see an extension of that old regime and the old paradigms, if you will, and applying them to the internet. I mean, the internet was really the first major communications or media platform in the last century that was born free, if you will. You know, you think about broadcast radio and broadcast television. I mean, these things were sort of born in regulatory captivity, and immediately there were people trying to cage them in with certain types of rules and techno-functional constructs, to use a term my old friend Randy May coined. And the problem is that those markets grew stagnant and less competitive than they should have been, precisely because of the existence of so much inefficient regulation. So my argument would be, yes, we've had a paradigm shift, but the paradigm shift has been away from a regulatory regime like that net neutrality would entail.
Now, Ben asserts that his proposal for net neutrality would not regulate the internet. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, the problem with that is, I mean, there's semantics here about the question of what the internet entails. I mean, the problem is it's not so neatly defined as some, I think, would hope to say, just this infrastructure layer and just these pipes. I get it. I mean, I know that's generally the focus that someone asks us to believe. But I'll ask everyone here just to take a look at a paper that my colleague Baron Sokin and I just put together at PFF, taking a look at some of the recent statements, filings, and other types of proceedings at the FCC that have started to explore all sorts of things that are well outside of the infrastructure or physical layer of the internet. I mean, you take a look at the wireless innovation proceeding that talk about cloud computing regulation that's in there and the question of dominance in the cloud. You talk about the proceeding that we just filed in today on empowering parents and protecting children, where the FCC has all sorts of creative regulatory theories about how they're going to get into various issues that they've never touched before, from video games to wireless services, privacy matters, and so on and so forth. The point is, is the slippery slope, again, is real, and it's hard for me to believe that once we start down this path, we can stop.
Now, on that front, Ben, I think you asserted you would not want to regulate the internet, and you speculated that Adam would agree with you, which I think I think we have found common ground there. But what about this regulatory creep argument, including some of the dockets that Adam mentioned? Do you agree that those are dangerous initiatives, or are you comfortable with some of those regulatory interventions?
Well, I think regulating the content and applications layer at the FCC is a bad idea as a general principle. I don't think net neutrality is related to those kinds of proceedings or those kinds of inquiries. Net neutrality is the basic idea that we are not going to have multiple providers of broadband internet access in the United States, and that is not going to be a sufficiently competitive market, and there will be strong financial incentives for the owners of the infrastructure to take advantage of their market power to reach over into adjacent markets and influence and distort what happens in those markets. And there's a legitimate question about whether you want that to happen. And there's a philosophy, I think, that Adam would espouse, that that's fine and that's the natural development of the market. From my point of view, that is what has always happened in media markets, and that is our opportunity now to prevent that in this case. And say, no, actually the content and applications layer of the internet is going to be a place where commerce and speech are in an absolute free market, and they're not controlled by government, and they're not controlled by the underlying owners of the facilities. And I don't buy the slippery slope argument because there's no way out of that box. If you say, well, in any event that you regulate, there's automatically going to be a slippery slope. You know, I think we've heard this argument in the banking sector some years back. You can't regulate any kind of our new innovative derivative products because there'll be a slippery slope and suddenly you'll be regulating the whole financial sector. Well, that didn't go well.
It's a good summary.
There's got to be there's a balancing point between using regulation to protect the public interest or to protect free markets where you can, and avoiding regulation in those areas where it will cause more harm than good. And to me, network neutrality is about the least possible thing you can do to protect the applications layer of the internet. If you look at overseas markets, their regulatory structure for telecommunications networks are much more intrusive and invasive than anything we're contemplating here in net neutrality proceeding. This is one tiny sliver at the very top to make sure that we have some backstop, some safeguard to ensure that a non-competitive facilities-based internet access market doesn't run amok and begin to distort the content applications there.
So Adam, how about that? We've got a broadband market that's characterized by duopoly between cable and telco. Shouldn't we be worried about them exercising market power in these vertical markets and limiting competition and innovation?
So we have a regulatory backstop, as Ben described. It's called antitrust law. I mean, we have standards in this country and laws that have been enforced for well over 100 years that deal with questions that have to do with market power and excessive concentration. I mean, the question is, with net neutrality, do you instead want to impose a preemptive prophylactic form of a regulatory regime on the internet, or do you want to instead take a different approach, one that we favor and that we've actually put together a document 5 years ago called Digital Age Communications Act, which is essentially sort of an antitrust and adjudicatory approach based upon looking at harms after the fact. So again, I haven't ruled out the prospect there of some sort of oversight of potential harms in the physical layer, but it's the same sort of approach we would take towards anything else. And if you wanted to import that FTC adjudicatory standard to the FCC, you could do it. But of course, we've already got the FTC and the Department of Justice who are there to do it themselves. So I don't see why we need to add another layer to it.
So Ben, why isn't antitrust enough?
When was the last time you heard of a consumer that successfully got the Department of Justice to file an antitrust claim when it's on their behalf? And how long does an antitrust claim take to process? It is simply an impossible mechanism to conduct oversight over harms in the marketplace that are occurring today. From a consumer perspective, I can't get to the sites that I want, I can't post the content that I want. What do I do about that? I'm not going to go to the Department of Justice and seek antitrust enforcement on AT&T. And if I did, I'm absolutely out of my mind. Or I'm so wealthy that I can hire Wiley Ryan to represent me. Second,
I think you might have a conflict.
as I recall, that doesn't stop with you.
Ouch.
Second point is, we're talking about an innovation marketplace where you've got startup firms happening all the time. And if the first line of their business plan of the new startup company is go cut a deal with AT&T and Comcast, how many venture capitalists are going to drop money into that can? Very, very few. Second, even if you were able to get venture capital to invest in your technology and you launch a new service and it becomes popular and you start earning revenues and AT&T says, wow, that looks pretty good, I'll have a piece of that. Oh, you don't want to give me a piece? Well, sorry, you're no longer operative on my network. And then I go and seek antitrust enforcement. I may well win, but I'm long since out of business before that judgment is rendered. So what we're looking at here is trying to use a traditional communications policy framework and an FCC that can adjudicate complaints in a much shorter time frame to set a set of post hoc principles that happen after the fact, whereby there's certainty for both consumers, innovators, and internet service providers about what happens in the market and what happens if there's a problem.
But it's not ex post at all. I mean, it's ex ante. I mean, the problem here is that Ben's whole approach is classic mother may I permission-based sort of regulatory regimes. You know, having to go to the FCC to get permission to innovate in any way as a carrier is a recipe for economic and investment disaster, in my opinion. And I don't see why we need to have that sort of approach when our antitrust laws, far be it from what Ben calls them as an impossible mechanism, have been there 100 years policing for legitimate forms of market power. But we give the market a chance to work or fail first. We don't preemptively come in and say, I don't think that's such a good idea. You know, we've been down that path before. We gave the FCC that sort of powers. We got all sorts of silly rules shoved down our throats on behalf of AT&T since AT&T had captured the commission throughout the past century. And the fact of the matter is that if you make the regime even bigger, that's going to even happen more.
And I want to come back to Ben and the Mother May I point, but what about I have the Free Cable Company in my hometown, and the Free Cable Company is blocking my access to whatever. Are you saying I need to go to the antitrust division to bring a complaint against the Free Cable Company? And I think Ben's point is that if I have a consumer complaint, I don't really have a mechanism if you leave this all on the
First of all, I feel sorry for you. You've got Ken Ferry as a cable provider. He's not the most technologically sophisticated guy.
It's a separate issue.
He's my good buddy and my former boss, but the fact of the matter is he's not good at that. So, you know, look, I mean, yes, there are ways to raise complaints and to try to get attention drawn to particularly egregious forms of behavior by certain carriers. I mean, without having to jump to nuclear solutions of having, you know, massive forms of regulatory interventions. One thing I hope we have a chance to get to is beyond this DACA framework is the potential for some sort of a development of norms and codes of conducts and independent sort of self-regulatory mechanisms that can and have worked in many other contexts and fields. I mean, I'm really heartened by the sorts of things I see like Dave Farber doing with the Net Neutrality Squad and other things like that, where there's a lot of voluntary policing or community policing of what happens on the internet. I mean, the internet is the greatest feedback loop that ever existed. And people are sitting around, you know, every moment saying, well, what's going on, and monitoring, you know, bit flows all over the internet. I mean, if carriers play games, there's going to be hell to pay with the press, the public, and a lot of others, even before we get to the question of regulation.
Well, let me take issue with that, and I'll give you an example. Well, first, let me cite, before the solution in search of a problem argument comes up, I know it will.
It's good to preempt the cliches.
I'll preempt that. You know, to my mind, it is not about the half a dozen or so things that have occurred in the market in the last few years that we can cite as net neutrality violations and issues of concern. It is about the hundreds of pages of filings and public statements from all the carriers who say, on one hand, we will never do this, and why would we ever do this? Violate net neutrality. And on the other hand, we have to do this in order to get a return on investment. Well, it is the latter set of arguments which suggest that their commitment to net neutrality is systemic. And their commitment to violating net neutrality is systemic. Their idea is we want to evolve a business which discriminates traffic against other traffic. That's fair. I would do that if I was them too. Their shareholders demand that. But that doesn't necessarily make it the right outcome for the internet. It doesn't make it the right outcome for competition and innovation. It doesn't make it the right outcome for consumers. So let's take the example, the most prominent example of a net neutrality violation, the Comcast BitTorrent case, which I'm sure many of you are familiar. And let's test Adam's theory that the internet would self-police itself and that this would all be taken care of by the community. Well, the problem was flagged by the community. For months and months and months on discussion boards, tech geeks were commenting, something's going on with BitTorrent. It seems like it's something with the cable company. All of my transmissions are being blocked. It's really hard to figure out how this is going on. Months and months and months of chatter back and forth trying to figure out what's going on. And then one guy in Oregon figures out how to sniff his packet back and discovers that in fact it's Comcast interfering with the traffic secretly and terminating his transmissions. He goes, that becomes a newspaper article and becomes a complaint at the FCC. For the next 4 months, Comcast says, we are absolutely not doing anything like this. We are not doing this. No. And then the commission investigates and the evidence begins to mount that they are in fact doing that. And then 8 months later, when the FCC says, yes, you were doing that and we're sanctioning you, they said, okay, yeah, we were doing all of those things that you said we were doing, and now we're going to change. The notion that Comcast would voluntarily have seen the complaints and the chatter about the potential of secret blocking on a chat board and have acted to remediate those claims all by itself in some sort of magic self-regulatory model just strikes me as absurd. That was the worst knockout, drag down war over one claim at the FCC. I can't imagine how that could possibly be adjudicated in some kind of a self-regulatory body.
Well, I disagree. I think there are ways that these sorts of things can be brought to light, and that the white hot spotlight of public attention and pressure can actually make a difference in these cases. I'm not saying that carriers never play games. I mean, carriers play games all the time, and I've never wanted to go around saying there's no such thing as market failure. I wake up and read TechMeme every day to look at all the mini market failures I see in the digital market every day. The interesting thing is how quickly they're all corrected, or how it spawns other activities by other players. And so sometimes the biggest kick in the pants for innovation to happen in industries, including in infrastructure industries, is for carriers to play games. And somebody else comes along and says, well, we're not going to play games. I mean, what was most interesting to me about the Comcast experience is how many other carriers said, well, we would have done this differently, or we have a different sort of approach to these things. And that's beneficial. I just don't want to jump the regulatory gun and have that lead to a sort of preemptive regulatory regime for the entire internet.
But what about this notion of mother may I, the mother may I problem, which is that if you promulgate these regulations, that carriers will be forced to come to the commission every time they think about a new traffic management technique or a new managed service in order to get the government's permission to innovate, and that chills innovation and investment?
You know, I think there's a lot of sort of misconceptions about what the SEC rules look like. The proposal actually has built into it a great deal of flexibility under the Regional Network Management Standard. I think that bright line tests will, supported by a technical advisory committee that is talking about these things on an ongoing basis with a legal backstop behind it to make it real, will mitigate a lot of those problems. And I think that for the most part, it will be very clear what's on the side of, what's on which side of the line and what's not. If you want to create a discriminatory business model that prioritizes and privileges some traffic over another, that's going to be out of bounds. If you have a congestion problem and you need a fix at 7:30 p.m. when everybody's online, that's going to fall under the Reasonable Network Management Standard. And over time, as these things are discussed with a legal backstop behind them, there will become clarity and certainty in the market. I actually think the uncertainty problem comes on the other side, which is we have no clarity about what should happen in network management. We have no rules, and suddenly you have chaos and conflict in the marketplace, and nobody knows whether or not that's going to trigger an intervention from the government because you have a big enough problem to get people's attention, which is another very common phenomenon in Washington, is overreaction having let a problem fester for too long.
Let me ask two questions to follow up on that. One is the flexibility point. You asserted that it will be clear on what's on either side, but I guess I'm trying to figure out, doesn't flexibility mean that almost inherently the companies won't know what's on either side because it's not going to have like a bright line rule?
What I mean by flexibility is you come to us with a tool that has this outcome. If the outcome is we're trying for engineering purposes and not commercial advantage to solve this problem, that rubric is almost always going to net you a check mark fine. That's all going to, and if you're on the other side of that line, this is not really an engineering issue, it's a commercial issue, that you can presume is not going to be on the right side of the line. You know, is there going to be gray area? Is there going to be dispute at the commission? Absolutely, but I think on balance, that is an acceptable outcome given the advantages you get from protecting an open market.
And on the technical advisory committee side, just real quick, how is that different from Adam's self-regulatory model? In other words, how, you're suggesting that would be used as a tool to develop rules. How is that different from technical advisory group outside of government?
So it doesn't. The technical advisory committee isn't used to develop rules. It's used to discuss network management tools, much like there are standard-setting bodies and engineering groups all over the country right now to do that. What makes it work and what makes it different than the self-regulatory model is that there is a legal backstop that makes it real. I think the reason why we saw a positive outcome out of the Comcast case is because there was a legal backstop. The reason why other people changed their behaviors and pledged not to do what Comcast is doing is because they didn't want to go down the same road. That's a valuable outcome.
I mean, the problem, I'm sorry, but I mean, everything I've just heard really does sound a lot like a Mother May I regime, and the fact of the matter is you are going to have to seek, under the standard that Ben is articulating and defending, the FCC's permission to engage in certain types of business practices. And the fact of the matter is that puts the Commission in an unenviable spot of having to decide winners and losers in terms of next generation infrastructure, internet infrastructure business models. And I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, is there network management that happens today that would be illegal under this? I mean, the cable model in general is network management galore. And it's, thank God for it. We have a 500-channel universe of services at our disposal that we didn't have 15 years ago. I mean, there had to be certainty so that cable and other satellite providers and multi-channel video providers could get the investment necessary to make that happen. And if they would have gone to the Commission and said, please, can we get, this is going to be really cool, well, let's talk about your obligations here and figure out if you've served the public interest by doing a, we'll get back to you about this in 18 months or 2 years. I'm sorry, this is a recipe for economic stagnation.
But these kinds of bright line rules exist all across the economy. We have rules to protect. We have rules where the financial sector is going to have to come to the SEC or to some subsequent regulator that they create to talk about, all right, we want to create this kind of financial product. Yes, we need to have some oversight to ensure that it doesn't trigger global financial meltdown. We have safety standards. The Toyota case is a good one. We have all kinds of rules at the EPA, at the FTC, where people have to evaluate, and they don't come and ask permission. They look at the rules and they evaluate for themselves, is this going to violate the rules or not? And there's lots of precedent that they can compare their case to. And I don't think that it is an overwhelming burden or an unusual burden to have bright line rules to protect public interest outcomes. And this is far superior to, I would say, from your perspective, to other regulatory models which are far more invasive and far more that they have overseas.
I would just say that the regulatory approach that I've outlined of having something that is ex post, adjudicatory-based, antitrust in nature after the fact, allows experimentation to happen without 5 unelected bureaucrats at the Federal Communications Commission being put in a position to divine what is reasonable network management or what's in the best interest of consumers. I'm sorry, it's a simple conflict of vision here. I don't trust the FCC to make that call correct.
And I don't think the antitrust authority will work. But there are problems that may need to be solved, so we got to figure out how to take a model of adjudicatory ex post complaint and map it onto an FCC, which, while imperfect, is the tool we have to use.
Well, speaking of that tool we have to use point, Adam's 5-part indictment in his opening comments focused first on legal. I think it's been widely perceived that the BitTorrent argument did not go well for the Commission. What's your view on the Commission's legal authority here? And if the BitTorrent case does not come out the right way, and I think you might have talked about this in your oral argument, what do you think should happen next?
Well, I mean, that's sort of the elephant in the room is if ancillary jurisdiction is fatally wounded, or if in fact it is already so fragile that it cannot support public interest policies on information networks. This is a question that goes way beyond network neutrality. Network neutrality will be a footnote in the history of what the implications of that legal demise really is, because it means that everything that stood up under Title I will be in jeopardy. And every time the Commission makes a rule based on its ancillary jurisdiction, it will be playing Russian roulette in the DC Circuit. So I would say if the Commission finds in the net neutrality proceeding or in the National Broadband Plan or in any of its many proceedings on different rules that will go into place on information hours, that its legal jurisdiction is wanting, fragile, or fatally wounded, that is an existential question for the agency, and one that will require a lot of debate and discussion to figure out, all right, what then? What is the right answer to that problem, and how do we fix it so that, leave aside net neutrality. Let's make sure that we can do universal service. Let's make sure we can do privacy protections. Let's make sure we can do truth in billing. Let's make sure we can do things that are just historically in the wheelhouse of the FCC.
And on that front, would you favor Title II resuscitation, or would you prefer that Congress jump in and fix it?
Well, if I could get the right outcome with legislation, I would do that. If I could get the right outcome on Title I, I would do that. If I could get the right outcome on Title II, I would do that.
Got it.
We have always said that on paper, the reclassification in 2002 led to a lot of these uncertainties and divisions and fractures in the law, and that there are ways to use forbearance to set up a regime under Title II that would work. We have also supported the Commission standing up policy on Title I because that's a tool that the last Commission was set on using. So it is a Rubik's Cube to try to figure out what the right answer is.
So it sounds like the free press approach here is sort of regulation by any means necessary. We'll take Title I, II, 6, throw in ancillary, anything that throws to the wall and stick, hopefully. The problem is, let's just get back to ancillary jurisdiction for a moment, because if that notion, if that standard is going to have any meaning, it has to be tethered to something in the law. And if the rule of law itself is going to have any legitimacy at the FCC and be obeyed, you have to show some sort of statutory authority and congressional intent that points to the power that you are attempting to exercise, not just some sort of vague principles that were articulated a while back. And that's why the Commission's going to lose this case in court, as well they should. Of course, there's nothing stopping the Commission or the supporters of regulation like free press from going to Congress and advocating that law be written to accomplish this. It seems like a lot of people are impatient in their zeal to start the regulatory